Or so.
I do 20.
Welcome to the Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's January 24th, 2025, and one of our major topics this week will be the first few days of the new Trump administration. I have to say I've been pleasantly surprised at how well organized the executive order and pardon rollout has been over the first few days, giving effectively blanket pardons to everyone involved in January 6th, finding multiple cases of pro-lifers who were clearly politically persecuted for their peaceful protests in front of abortion clinics, Planned Parenthoods, and the like, doing what other grandstanding pro-life politicians, previous presidents, never came close to doing. Trump did right out of the gate. He kept his promise to grant a pardon to Ross Ulbricht, who is a person that the vast majority of Americans have never even heard of, who has been rotting away in prison for a decade for running something comparable to eBay, but without restrictions on substances that were banned either federally or at the state level. And these were not popular moves. With regards to the January 6th participants, YouGov economists poll this week asked respondents if they supported or opposed the pardons that Trump granted to those J6ers, and just 34% of respondents supported it compared to 53% who opposed, with a majority of independents being in opposition. So this was not a popular thing for Trump to do right out of the gate, and yet he did it in the first day of his first term, when he could have done it. He could have done this pardon the last month or the last couple of weeks of his first term, but elected not to do so. And now he is doing it 4 years later, when it doesn't necessarily benefit him politically to do so. This is indicative of someone who is using the political power he has to reward his friends, and hopefully we'll see more punishing of his enemies. Even predating his first official day in power, he had the politically masterful TikTok restoration, where the message that was delivered to users who were kicked off of their TikTok app and the TikTok browser the Sunday before he was sworn in, the message that the 150 or 170 million TikTok users in America received read, quote, "Welcome back. Thanks for your patience and support. As a result of President Trump's efforts, TikTok is back in the U.S." And in the aggregate, that was not a popular move for Trump to make, at least not at first blush. The Economist YouGov poll also asked about support for the TikTok ban, and among the general population, 46% supported a ban compared to just 26% in opposition, with the remaining 28% saying that they were not sure. But there's an enormous generational divide. Among boomers, those 65 and older, just 9% say that they oppose the ban compared to 68% who said they supported it. The only generational cohort in opposition to the ban are those under the age of 30, Zoomers, 41% opposed to 29% in support. And the people who are going to be most emphatically moved by how the government interacts with TikTok are going to be those who are in opposition to the ban, because those are going to be the people who use TikTok. And though Trump did better than previous Republican presidents did in the 2024 election among that under 30 cohort, he still lost that age range, and it is still a demographic that is not one of his strongest bastions of support. So doing something like this that benefits a constituency that is not naturally particularly sympathetic, to benefit them in this way could have a real effect in terms of solidifying some of the new support that he's received. It reminds me of when the stimulus checks went out in 2020 and Trump had the political astuteness to sign the checks himself, to have his signature put on the checks. And there were lots of people, most hilariously, a lot of, let's say, low information black voters who took to social media and other places to sing the praises of Trump for paying them the way that he did. And of course, blacks, in particular black men, are another constituency that is not favorably inclined in the majority towards Trump, obviously, but it is a constituency like those under the age of 30 that Trump made marked improvements on relative to the Republican baseline and to previous Republican presidential candidates.
I agree with you, Ness. I think Trump being seen as facilitating TikTok being available, he stands to benefit more politically from that, because I could see Gen Z, especially people who use TikTok a lot, or that generation, of course, uses TikTok the most, and good number of Gen Zers also make a living off TikTok, and so they're going to be more passionate about the issue. I think an issue like that, if Trump is able to be seen as Trump is given the credit for allowing TikTok, then that could be enough to turn potentially some Gen Zers from the unfavorable to from unfavorably viewing Trump to favorably viewing him. On the other hand, I don't think if you're a boomer who supports Trump, I don't think this TikTok thing is enough to turn you against Trump altogether.
The phrase for that in politics is that of concentrated benefits and diffused costs. The idea being that even though the majority is in opposition to something, those who support it are much more emphatic and concentrated in their support. That minority is more emphatic and concentrated in their support than the majority is in their opposition. So I think this restoration of TikTok, at least temporarily, to those users is something that means a lot more to them than it does to those who would say that they are in support of the TikTok ban but are not nearly as motivated as those who are opposed to the ban are.
And that also gets to the limitations of a poll with the dichotomy of agree or oppose. It doesn't necessarily tell you how passionately any person feels about it. So a year or two ago, in between Trump's terms, he came out, I believe, pretty strongly in favor of banning TikTok. And now in 2025, he appears to be against banning it. What do you think accounts for that change, Ness?
In the interim years during Biden's presidency, while Trump was out of power and many influencers on Twitter and Instagram and other places were being banned, supporters of Trump and of MAGA and of America First, the ban hammer came down in a lot of places on a lot of those supporters of Trump, but it was pointed out to him that on TikTok that wasn't the case. And so I think it really is as simple as he found a lot of accounts, or they were brought to his attention with millions or tens of millions of followers who were very supportive of him in ways that people were unable to be openly supportive of him and his movement on other media platforms, social media platforms during the same period of time.
So basically, Trump just likes flattery.
Yeah, I think so. And it's easy to scoff at that, but we don't want philosopher kings. What we want from politicians are people who wield power to get us the results that we want. That's the purpose of politics. And that's not to say that the susceptibility to flattery is an unvarnished good quality to have, a desirable characteristic, because it can be exploited. Although it is worth noting how, as well known as it is that Trump seems to be susceptible to flattery, how hard it was for so many members of the managerial class to, for whatever reason, there's just something about him, something I first recall noticing in 2015 when I followed Charles Murray very closely, and I could see a man who is normally very measured and circumspect and analytical in the way that he analyzes things really come down with a strong case of Trump derangement syndrome, where you could tell in everything he communicated about Trump that he had a visceral disdain for him, one that he wouldn't articulate why, because of course his Twitter feed at the time was full of what was the budding inchoate dissident right or alt-right at the time, made up a big chunk of his supporter base, and he was peppered with endless questions about why, when so much of what Trump was campaigning on would seemingly be in line with a lot of the observations that Charles Murray had made over the years in terms of problems facing the country and how demographics played into that despite all of these things, Charles Murray clearly had utter disdain for Trump. And so I think Charles Murray is somebody who definitely is a member of the managerial class. And I think a lot of this is a status thing, a class status thing, where Trump seems so vulgar and his mannerisms are so outside the norms of the conduct of the managerial class that they have an allergic reaction that they seem incapable of controlling, such that even though it was well known that Trump was susceptible to flattery and that sucking up to him would allow members of the managerial class and the deep state to get close to him and then sabotage him, and there certainly was some of that, but a lot of that he sniffed out, not because he was ideologically astute or that he realized necessarily that these people were at a very deep level opposed to everything that he stood for, but simply because he had contentious personal disputes with them that ended up in blow-ups that ended up with them being sent packing. And almost the sole exception to that dynamic that I can think of is Mike Pompeo, who seems to still have a pretty good working relationship with Trump, even though really he's the alphabet agency's man. I mean, everything that he stands for in terms of foreign policy is diametrically opposed to the America First foreign policy initiative, maybe accepting Israel, but in terms of rhetoric and dealing with dissidents like Julian Assange, he is so far out of step with the rest of MAGA, and yet because he was able to, throughout the duration of Trump's first term and apparently through the 4 years that Trump was out of power, not allow that Trump derangement syndrome to handicap his ability to interact with Trump, he still seems to be in Trump's good graces. Another one who did that, at least through the first term until January 6th, was Mike Pence, who is also not in lockstep with Trump on hardly anything, but was able to stay in Trump's good graces because he was simply able to flatter Trump. Additionally, in his first week, Trump did what we suggested he do here at The Reality Taboo, which was to declare a state of emergency on the border to unshackle the potential iron fist that we're hoping that he utilizes to kick mass deportations into gear. And granted, this stuff in the first week is the easy stuff. It is the things that as long as Trump has his stuff together, these things are going to happen. The things that require the bureaucracy to move in the future will be where the real test is.
Ness, as we discussed last week, you're very skeptical that mass deportations will occur under Trump. It occurred to me during the last week that we should try to define that term a little bit more, because obviously he's no question he is deporting some people. So how many people does he need to deport for you to be satisfied that he has achieved mass deportations?
Yeah, I think a metric is important because we could also, of course, point out that the Biden administration did some deportations as well. I would be pleasantly shocked really, if the number at the end of the Trump second term is in the seven figures. I would consider that, I would grant that as mass deportation, and I would confess to missing the mark in being skeptical that we'll get anything like mass deportations going. But as it so happens, ICE, U.S. Immigrations and Customs Enforcement, is publicly reporting, at least the first couple of days of Trump's second term, January 23rd and January 24th, ICE reported daily arrests and detainers logged. It was 538 on January 23rd and 593 on January 24th. So if we extrapolate that out, if that is the rate of deportations carried forward, that comes to about 12 to 15,000 per month, or in the vicinity of 120 to 150,000 per year, which comes to around 500,000 over the course of Trump's first term. Now that, of course, is doing a lot of extrapolating from just the first couple of days. The black-pilled side of me thinks that we'll have higher numbers at first when people are paying attention to it, and then it will just go down from there. And if the high mark number is in the hundreds per day, then we're not going to get anything close to mass deportations. Now, on the other side, we could look at the more white-pilled perspective and think that this is simply going to be ramped up over time, and that 500 per day is a lower bound number that will increase over time as the enforcement mechanisms get kicked into gear and as state and local law enforcement are incorporated into the efforts at deportation. And we could see some number higher than 500,000 over the course of Trump's second term.
We also need to talk about self-deportation, because it's not just the number that ICE officially deports. I think it's also the general atmosphere that is created. You listen to left-wing sources of news right now, the way that they tell it is that there's tremendous fear and anxiety in the illegal immigration community of the United States. And so you have to imagine that at least some number of people will self-deport, because most of the people in the United States illegally are not here because they fear for their lives. They're here because they can make more money here and they can improve their material well-being by being here. It's not like if they went back to Mexico or Central or South America that their lives would be in danger.
Yes, there will undoubtedly be some of that occurring. There is historical precedence for this, as we've talked about previously here, with Operation Wetback in 1950s during the Eisenhower administration, where about 80,000 illegal aliens were forcibly deported, and it was estimated that between 600 and 800,000 left of their own volition as a way of avoiding deportation, and simply because it was no longer thought to be easy to live in the country illegally. And so making it more difficult made it less desirable as an outcome for those here illegally. And so hundreds of thousands of them left on their own. That was about, if you do the numbers there, if you do the math there, it's for every one alien forcibly removed, 7 or 8 of them left on their own. And so if we had a situation here where 500,000 were deported forcibly over the course of Trump's second term, and 7 or 8 times as many of those left on their own, we'd be approaching 8 figures in terms of illegal aliens removed from the country, upwards of 8 or 10 million. And I would certainly classify that as a success with regards to reaching mass deportation levels.
Hopefully the Trump administration will crack down on the employers, because that's probably the biggest magnet, is the employment that illegal aliens have access to. If there are real consequences for American employers for employing illegal aliens, that'll help stem the flood. So I think so far so good on immigration. It's too early to tell, so something that we will continue to watch very closely. The other big news regarding immigration was Trump's executive order reinterpreting the 14th Amendment birthright citizenship clause, or the clause that has been interpreted as granting birthright citizenship. So that's specifically Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, which was passed just after the Civil War. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. So I think the key phrase that's going to attract the most argument and disagreement and dispute is subject to the jurisdiction thereof. What does that mean? Because if you took that out, I think it's pretty clear that birthright citizenship is accurate, is correct. So without that, it'd just be all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States.
But the fact that you just stated what you did indicates that there is a pressure point there, because if reading it, all persons born or naturalized in the United States are citizens of the United States, that would be clear-cut, straightforward. So why the insertion of the phrase subject to the jurisdiction thereof? Is that just superfluous? If everyone in the United States is subject to the jurisdiction of the United States, then why even put that phrase in the amendments at all? Are, say, for example, military invaders of a foreign country coming into the United States, are they subject to the same jurisdiction, the same jurisprudence that American citizens are, or are they to be treated separately and differently and have a different set of standards and laws and rights that apply to them? And I think that is the approach that the Trump administration is going to need to take. Ideally, the cleanest way to strip away the putative 14th Amendment protections for birthright citizenship would be for Congress to legislatively make clear that simply being born in the United States does not automatically grant citizenship. There are only around 40 countries in the world that have a birthright citizenship clause in the way that they grant citizenship. 34 countries to be precise, according to Wikipedia, and the only one in all of Asia, which of course has nearly half the world's population, is Pakistan. So China and India do not have birthright citizenship. So the majority of countries numerically and the vast majority of people in the world live in countries that do not have birthright citizenship. In typical Trumpian fashion, then, Trump was directionally correct when he pointed out that the United States was the only country in the world that had birthright citizenship. Directionally correct, but not precisely accurate.
So I think the Trump administration has an uphill battle from a textual argument, but textualism is not the only method of interpretation that judges use. There are other things that are valid to examine, such as legislative history or extrinsic evidence as a whole, more generally. So that'd be things such as committee reports, the congressional or legislative debates, so the debates that were happening at the time, contemporaneous with the time that, for instance, so in this case for the 14th Amendment, what were the senators and Congress people and even the president and the president's cabinet, what were the discussions they were having? And then you'd want to look specifically, well, who were the senators or congressmen who actually drafted that clause of the 14th Amendment? And so all that stuff is relevant, as well as just the text itself. And so, for instance, Senator Jacob Howard, who actually drafted the citizenship clause of the 14th Amendment, he said at the time, quote, "This will not, of course, include persons born in the United States who are foreigners, aliens, who belong to the families of ambassadors or foreign ministers accredited to the government of the United States, but will include every other class of persons." And zooming out even a little bit broader, the context was clearly the intent of the 14th Amendment was to ensure that the blacks, African Americans, had citizenship, that there wasn't, it made it hard, at least more difficult, to deny black people in the United States citizenship. It very, very obviously was not in any way intended for people sneaking across the border from Central or South America or anywhere in the world who were able to sneak into the United States and happen to give birth to a child while doing so, that those children would be citizens. So in summary, I think if it's a purely textual argument, the Trump administration is going to have a difficult time. But the more context that is allowed to be brought in, I think the better for the Trump administration prevailing. And as was very predictable, the executive order was immediately opposed, and a judge in Seattle issued an preliminary injunction. So I assume this will make it up to the Supreme Court. And if it does, that will be momentous. I think of the 9, assuming that by the time, if it does make it up to the Supreme Court, that the composition is the same as it is now, I think it's very clear that the 3 liberal justices, Sotomayor, Kagan, and Ketanji Brown Jackson, they'll all vote against the Trump administration. So that just leaves the 6. And I think it actually is pretty hard to predict how any of those 6 will vote. Again, if it makes it up there, it'll be interesting.
This fight will be a good barometer of the second Trump administration's seriousness in terms of enacting the MAGA America First agenda, because unlike building the wall and mass deportations, which do enjoy public support, there is not a majority of public support for ending birthright citizenship. From the same YouGov Economist poll with over 1,600 respondents that we've referred to a couple times here previously on the question of, quote, ending the automatic granting of citizenship to children born in the U.S. to undocumented immigrants, unquote, just 40% support doing so compared to 49% in opposition. And even among whites, it's split evenly at 45% support, 45% opposition. Among blacks, 24% support to 59% oppose, and among Hispanics, 29% in support compared to 57% in opposition. So among whites are split evenly, and then blacks and Hispanics, both by a 2-to-1 margin, are opposed to the ending of birthright citizenship. As an aside, it's frustrating to see how little consistency there is in the opinion of the public. Broadly defined, there are a lot of problems with democracy, and this is certainly one, the logical inconsistency here. So there are majorities that support building a wall and executing mass deportations, but oppose the ending of birthright citizenship. So build a wall to stop them and then deport them if they scale the wall. But if they have a baby here before you're able to nab them after they scale the wall, then the baby is a citizen and is able to anchor the rest of the family here. Although Trump is certainly not a dictator on day one, he is closer to that than I had thought he was going to be. And I say that not regrettably, but as something that I find moderately encouraging. It is worth noting, too, from the same poll, there is a question about support or opposition to, quote, Trump prosecuting people who have been critical of him, unquote. And what I found remarkable is that the highest support for Trump prosecuting those who are critical of him comes from those under the age of 30. So I say remarkable, but not surprising, because it's a theme I've visited multiple times here, where we see that younger cohorts are much more accepting of and even supportive of violence as a means of political action. And so even as a group, though boomers are more supportive of Trump than Zoomers are, just 14% of boomers say that they support Trump prosecuting or those who are critical of him, while 71 oppose. So that's a net opposition of, I said 71% oppose. It's 78% who oppose to just 14% of boomers who support, which comes to a net opposition of 64% compared to Zoomers, where 20% support and just 63% oppose. So only a 43% net opposition. So, of course, majorities in both cases, and majorities overall, are opposed to Trump prosecuting those who have been critical of him, but boomers are about twice as likely to be opposed to it as Zoomers are. Also, this poll asks the question that has been asked many times over the last couple of years, where it inquires about American sympathies with regards to the Middle East. And by a 2-to-1 margin, Americans sympathize more with Israelis than with Palestinians, and that's virtually unchanged. In fact, I think it's almost exactly the same. It is the same ratio, virtually the exact same percentages as was the case in October and November of 2023. Seemed clear to me that the second iteration of the MAGA movement was going to be America first plus Israel, or America first with Israel as the 51st state or the first state, and that was going to be the compromise, that Israel would get roped in, but the rest of the world would be roped out. And I don't see anything that indicates otherwise as far as the first few days of the Trump administration goes, to the objection that Trump negotiated a temporary ceasefire in the Gaza Strip. That seems to have been a ploy to give the green light to Israel to make inroads militarily in the West Bank, which has a much larger population than the Gaza Strip does. And it looks like this is going to be the next step in escalation against the Palestinian population bordering, or actually inside of, Israel proper. I'll pop one last polling black pill here, a question about diversity in the United States. Respondents were asked, quote, "Do you think having an increasing number of people of many different races, ethnic groups, and nationalities makes the U.S. a better place or a worse place to live?" Unquote. Overall, 44% said better, 12% said worse, with the remaining 51% saying either it doesn't make much difference or they weren't sure. So by a more than 3-to-1 ratio, those who have an opinion at all say that diversity, specifically racial and ethnic diversity, makes the country better. And so the way to read that, if you are of Northwestern European descent, or if you are of sub-Saharan African descent, if you hail back to a time when the United States was 90% European and 10% African, if you are sent to this, are saying that the diminution of your ancestors and in the future your descendants, if there are fewer of them and more of people who are not them, that makes the country a better place to live, if you are agreeing to this statement. And among whites, 41% say that it does make the country a better place to live, compared to just 14% who say it makes it a worse place to live. And among blacks, it's 59% who say it makes it a better place to live, compared to just 5% who say it makes it a worse place to live. And even among Trump supporters, among those who have an opinion one way or the other, a majority say that diversity makes the country a better place to live. 28% say a better place to live, compared to just 22% who say it makes it a worse place to live. The mantra that diversity is our strength is one that comes in for a lot of ridicule on the dissident right, but the stark reality is, when put to the test, just 12% of Americans, about 1 in 8, really do think that diversity, rather than being a strength, is a weakness. And about half of the country thinks that it is affirmatively a strength, while another 50% don't really have an opinion one way or the other. And if your instinct is to take umbrage at my insinuating criticism towards those who do not think that diversity is a bad thing, to those who think that it is either something that should be celebrated or something that they should be indifferent to, imagine instead of the United States being referred to, we were talking about China or Nigeria. Would you say that China would be better off if more people who weren't Chinese moved into China to dilute the Chinese-ness of China? Would that be a good thing? If more non-Africans moved into Nigeria, would that... All right, well, maybe that is not as effective rhetorically, but stick to China or Japan or any of these other well-functioning countries that have a strong majority population. Is it something to celebrate if that population is reduced proportionally in the country that is theirs, that has a nationality that is named after the majority ethnicity that lives in the country? We aren't talking about the global demographic distribution. When people say that they want less diversity, it doesn't mean that they necessarily want less racial diversity or ethnic diversity on a global scale, but in the country that is theirs, that is supposed to exist for their benefit, that they want that country to be populated by people who have the same beliefs and share the same race and ethnicity and religion and language and all the other characteristics that make a culture what it is, to simply assert that you want that to be preserved rather than be diluted or erased. If that is something that makes you uncomfortable, well, first of all, understanding that we live in the current year in 21st century Western world, I understand why that would make you uncomfortable, because it could cost you your job, it could cost you a lot of social status. There are a lot of real world consequences to saying that diversity is not a strength. But I would ask you to think about it in isolation, stripped of the status concerns and the social impact, and just think about logically and philosophically how healthy or unhealthy it is to have that position, to hold that position, that somehow wanting to live in a country with people who believe the same things that you do and share a same culture that you do, why that is considered inherently pathological, and who is causing you to think that it is inherently pathological when the people in China and the people in Nigeria would never think something so self-abnegating.
I'll just end with, I think Trump optically, stylistically has been quite impressive so far. I watched the inauguration. I think his speech was good. I think all the pomp and circumstance was well done. I think the speech he gave to his supporters, I think it was in the visitor center to the Rotunda, was solid. The only misstep I've seen is that female Episcopalian bishop who lectured him the other day, but Trump should know better by now. He should have known that this woman, especially a few years ago during the BLM, said some really, really radical things, and he should have known what to expect, so he shouldn't have put himself in that position in the first place to be chastised like that. But other than that, I think I've been very impressed, and I think part of that is just, I'll say, hopefully never have to utter his name again, but Joe Biden. I think part of the reason Trump looks so impressive is how unimpressive Biden was. And if there's any justice, if there's any objectivity in when the history books are written, Biden will go down as easily one of the top 5 worst U.S. presidents. I was thinking the other day, the only one I can think of that is clearly worse might be George W. Bush or Lyndon Baines Johnson. But Biden has just been such a disaster from beginning to end. Just the invasion at our southern border, the refusal to enforce immigration law, the horrible handling of COVID, the nasty, mean-spirited way he talked about people who chose not to get the vaccine, the way he tried to sick OSHA on employers to force that to essentially try to get employees who didn't get vaxxed to be fired. Despite it being the correct decision to withdraw from Afghanistan, I don't think anyone would argue that was handled well. And there are other disastrous things that happened under his watch, but more just the obvious senility and dementia that just got worse and worse as the term went on. Even compared to 2019, 2020, 2024, Biden was significantly worse. So he just got worse and worse and worse during his term, and his whole administration covering up for him, the media covering up for him is one of the biggest scandals in U.S. history. He gave what was the worst performance any presidential candidate has ever given in the June 2024 debate in Atlanta. And just when you thought things couldn't get any worse, from June to now, I would say between June and when he finally left office was one of the most precipitous declines in history, from the debate itself to his own party trying to push him out for 2-3 weeks, his refusal to step aside, and then his humiliating tweet announcement that he would drop out of the race that some people speculate he didn't even write or might not even have known about. And then his supposed reason for running was because he couldn't allow Trump to take office. He had to stop Trump, and then he literally is succeeded by Trump himself. All the pardons that he issued, the pardon of his son Hunter, who he said repeatedly he would never pardon, and then at the last second pardoning the January 6th committee, his own other family members, Anthony Fauci, despite, again, when right before Biden taking office, him saying that preemptive pardons were per se wrong. It just, the list goes on and on and on. Truly a horrible, disgraceful man. And then I didn't even talk about all his personal corruption. But anyway, glad to see him gone. Hope we never hear from him again.
This was the culmination of 50 years of his, quote, public service, unquote. And he, in some ways, the spectacular nature of the decline and the revelations, really the things that it laid bare, things that were not as revelatory to those who are online and have been paying attention to this closely in terms of the relationship, the corrupted relationship between the corporate media and the administrative state, and how they just lied blatantly and shamelessly in front of the world for years on end to cover for a pretty unremarkable cipher of the deep state of the managerial class and of the neoliberal order. I really think that's what Biden represents more than anything else. But one potentially hopeful silver lining of some of those last-minute pardons that he made is it could set up a situation, especially if somebody like Rand Paul, who has pledged to not relent in getting to the bottom of the Fauci COVIDian cover-up. The pardon of Fauci could serve as a real opportunity to get to the truth and get that truth publicly aired. He was pardoned for past crimes, but if he's put under subpoena, he will be forced to tell the truth or be subjected to potentially new charges, new crimes that the previously issued pardons won't cover. And somebody psychopathic like Fauci is just the kind of person who would make the calculation that to save his own skin, he will be able to throw other people under the bus, since he will have full immunity for any criminal actions, no matter how heinous, that occurred in the last decade, but that he will only be subject to potential legal trouble in the future if he lies about those when he is subpoenaed, when he's forced to testify potentially in front of Congress. As long as he doesn't perjure himself, it doesn't matter what he says he did, he will have immunity. And so he could, in a seemingly perverse way, Biden pardon and Fauci himself could, if Rand Paul makes good on what he has pledged to do, could serve as a window into what really happened over 2020 to 2022, and even before then, 2018 and 2019, with regards to biolabs and gain of function research and who directed who to do what and why, and what the official reasons were, what the unofficial reasons were, how this ties into Ukraine and the apparent bio-research facilities in Ukraine that were either overseen or, if not outright controlled by the West, by the United States and by NATO. And so that's my hope for Biden's legacy, that in a roundabout way, he actually does allow us to shed some light on some of those things. That'll do it for us this week. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.